The wind in Wyoming in 1879 didn't just bite, it devoured. It stripped the heat from a man's bones, left ice in his beard, and whispered promises of a cold, quiet grave. Josiah Creek knew that wind better than any man alive. He was a creature of the mountains, a man who'd traded the noise of towns for the honest silence of the peaks. He was leading his mule, a stubborn beast named Clementine, down a path that was more memory than trail. The snow was knee-deep, a fresh blanket hiding the sins of the earth below. Clementine was loaded down with the stuff of survival: salt pork, beans, ammunition, and a small precious sack of coffee beans that had cost him his last real silver. He was heading for his cabin, a place of rough-hewn logs and warm fires, his only refuge from the coming dark of winter. But the silence today was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air before a storm breaks. The birds were gone. The squirrels were hidden. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Josiah pulled Clementine to a halt, his hand instinctively going to the rifle slung over his shoulder. He'd learned long ago that when the mountains go quiet, you'd better start listening. And then he heard it. A sound so faint it was almost nothing. A whimper, thin and sharp, stolen by the wind almost as soon as it was born. It was human. It was pain. Josiah's blood went cold. He called out, his voice a cannon shot in the stillness. "Hello!" The only answer was the echo, bouncing off the canyon walls. Then it came again, weaker this time, a thread of sound from deep within the trees. He tied Clementine to a pine, his movements quick and sure. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard, the cold steel a familiar comfort in his hands. Trouble in these mountains came in all shapes and sizes, and most of them had teeth. He followed the sound into a grove of aspens, their white trunks like a forest of bones. The snow got deeper, the air colder, his breath plumed in front of him, vanishing in the bitter air. And then he saw it. A shape against a tree. A splash of color that didn't belong in this world of white and gray. He pushed through a final drift of snow, and his heart hammered against his ribs. It was a girl. A young girl, barely a woman, tied to the trunk of a massive cottonwood tree. Thick rope bit into her arms, pinning her there like a butterfly in a collection. Her head was slumped forward, a curtain of blonde hair hiding her face. But that wasn't what made Josiah stop breathing. It was the swell of her belly beneath the thin, torn fabric of her dress. She was pregnant, heavily pregnant, and she was dying. He whispered the words to the uncaring trees. "Sweet Mother of God." He lunged forward, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He dropped his rifle and reached for her. Her skin was a terrifying shade of blue, the color of a frozen lake. When he touched her neck, she felt as cold as stone. For a terrible second, he thought he was too late. But then he felt it. A pulse. Faint, fluttering. A tiny bird trapped in a cage of ice, but it was there. She was alive. His hands, clumsy with cold and haste, worked at the ropes with his hunting knife. The hemp was frozen solid, as hard as iron. As he sawed at the fibers, his mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who would do this? Who leaves a pregnant child to die in the Wyoming winter? He finally sliced through the last strand of rope, and her body sagged, lifeless. He caught her before she hit the snow, her weight almost nothing in his arms. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. Her eyes were the pale, clear green of new spring leaves. She tried to speak, but only a dry croak came out. He had to lean his ear to her lips to hear the words, "Please, don't hurt me." The plea, whispered from the very edge of death, broke something inside him. "I'm not going to hurt you, child," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. He shrugged off his heavy wolfskin coat and wrapped it around her trembling frame. "My name's Josiah Creek. I'm getting you somewhere warm." She tried to nod, a tiny movement of her head, then her face contorted in pain. Her hands, blue and frostbitten, went to her swollen belly. Through the layers of his coat and her thin dress, Josiah could see the baby move, a frantic, desperate motion. "What's your name?" he asked, lifting her as gently as he could. She was so light. Mercy, she breathed, the name a ghost of a sound. Mercy Caldwell. He managed to get her onto Clementine's back, securing her with a length of rope so she wouldn't fall. As they started the slow trek back toward his cabin, he asked the question that was burning in his mind. Mercy, who did this to you? Fresh tears traced clean paths through the grime on her frozen cheeks. My family, she whispered, her voice cracking. My aunt and uncle. They said I brought shame on them. They said the baby was a curse. Josiah's hands clenched into fists on the mule's lead rope. He'd seen the worst of men in his life. He'd been the worst of men, once upon a time. But this was a new kind of evil. This was a darkness he couldn't comprehend. He had to get her to safety. He had to save her. But as the first flakes of a new storm began to fall, he saw her shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering like dice. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind, that surviving the cold was only the first battle. The real fight was just beginning. The journey back to the cabin was a nightmare. The snow began to fall in thick, heavy sheets, blinding them, erasing the trail. Mercy drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words he couldn't understand. The baby inside her was a restless prisoner, kicking and turning as if it knew their lives hung by a thread. Every step Josiah took was a prayer. Every gust of wind felt like a personal attack. The mountain wanted them. It wanted to claim them, to pull them down into its cold, white embrace. But Josiah wouldn't let it. He'd run from his own life for years, but he wouldn't run from this. He wouldn't let this girl and her unborn child become two more ghosts in these unforgiving hills. Finally, through the swirling snow, he saw it. A faint, golden light. His cabin. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a beacon of hope in the frozen wilderness. He'd banked the fire that morning, and it had held. He half-carried, half-dragged Mercy from the mule's back and through the heavy wooden door. The sudden warmth of the cabin was a shock to the system. He laid her on his own bed, a simple cot built into the wall, and piled every blanket he owned on top of her. Her skin was still frighteningly pale against the dark wool. "Stay with me, child," he urged, his hands shaking as he lit an oil lamp. The golden light filled the small room, chasing the shadows into the corners. It was a simple place, the home of a man who needed little. Furs on the floor, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a small collection of books on a rough-hewn shelf. In the lamplight, he saw the true extent of her injuries. The bruises that ringed her wrists were a deep, ugly purple. Her dress was torn, and he could see her ribs starkly outlined beneath her skin. She was starved. But the baby was a fighter. He saw a tiny foot push against the wall of her belly. He started a fire roaring in the hearth, melting snow for water. He tore strips from one of his own clean shirts, his mind working faster than it had in years. He needed to get her warm. He needed to get food into her. He checked her forehead. A fever was building, a dangerous heat that had nothing to do with the fire. Outside, the storm broke in earnest. Thunder cracked, a sound like the world splitting in two. A flash of lightning lit up the cabin, and in that stark white light, Mercy's eyes flew open. Where am I?" she asked, her voice thin and reedy. "You're safe," Josiah said, his voice softer than he'd intended. He brought a cup of warm water to her lips. "You're safe now." He began to clean the wounds on her wrists, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such calloused hands. He ladled some broth he'd been warming into a bowl and held it for her. "Tell me everything," he said. And she did. The story came out in a torrent of tears and pain. Her aunt and uncle, Samuel and Margaret Caldwell, pillars of the church in the small town of Laramie. They'd taken her in after her parents died. They'd treated her like a servant, a burden. Then she'd met Robert Henderson, a charming boy who'd promised her the world. When she told him she was pregnant, he'd vanished, leaving only a note saying he was heading for the gold fields in California. He was too young for this kind of trouble. Her family's reaction had been swift and brutal. She was a source of shame, a stain on their good name. They couldn't have a bastard child born under their roof. So they'd driven her out into the wilderness, Her own uncle had tied her to that tree. "He said if God wanted me to live, he would provide," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "And if not, then it was his will." Josiah's jaw was a knot of stone. He had heard of men who twisted scripture to justify their own cruelty, but this was beyond the pale. "How long were you there?" he asked. "2 days," she said. "Maybe more. I lost count." 2 days. In the freezing cold, pregnant, without food or water. The girl was made of something stronger than steel. But as the night wore on, her fever climbed. She began to shiver violently, her body racked with chills. She cried out in her sleep, begging for her mother, begging for someone to help her. Josiah sat by her bed all night, bathing her forehead with cool cloths, forcing sips of broth between her lips. He felt a helplessness he hadn't known in years. He could track a grizzly, build a shelter in a blizzard, survive on his own for months. But he didn't know how to fight a fever. He didn't know how to save a child. As the storm raged outside, he found himself doing something he hadn't done since he was a boy. He knelt by her bedside, bowed his head, and prayed. He prayed for mercy. For her. For the baby. And for himself. He didn't know it then. But something shifted in that small, storm-tossed cabin that night. The broken man who had run to the mountains to escape his past was gone. In his place was a man with a purpose. He had to save her. He just didn't know if he could. And then, he saw something else. On the inside of her wrist, partially hidden by the rope burns, was a small, faded brand. It was a simple shape, a star inside a circle. It was a mark he recognized, a mark he hadn't seen in 20 years, and it changed everything. The brand on her wrist was the mark of the Starlight Cattle Company, a ranching outfit known for two things: the finest horses in the territory, and a ruthlessness that was legendary. Josiah knew that brand because he'd once worn it himself. It was a lifetime ago, before the drinking, before the trouble, before he'd fled to the mountains to forget the man he used to be. The Starlight was run by a man named Elias Thorne, a man who ruled his empire with an iron fist. And Elias Thorne had a son. A wild, reckless boy named Robert. Robert Henderson. The name Mercy had whispered. The name of the boy who had run off to California. It couldn't be a coincidence. The baby she carried wasn't just the child of some runaway farmhand. It was the grandchild of the most powerful and most dangerous man in Wyoming. Josiah felt a new kind of fear settle in his gut. This wasn't just about a cruel uncle and a shamed family anymore. This was about power and money and secrets. If Elias Thorne ever found out about this child, there was no telling what he would do. He could try to take the baby, or he could try to erase the problem entirely. And that meant erasing Mercy and anyone who helped her. For 3 weeks, Josiah kept this knowledge locked away in his heart. He focused on nursing Mercy back to health. Slowly, miraculously, her fever broke. The color returned to her cheeks. She began to eat, first broth, then solid food. She was still weak, but the fire was back in her eyes. The cabin, once just a shelter for a lonely man, began to feel like a home. Mercy was neat and organized. She mended his clothes, kept the fire going, and even managed to make his terrible cooking taste halfway decent. They talked for hours by the fire in the evenings. He learned about her dreams of becoming a teacher, her love for books. She had a quick mind and a sharp wit that surprised him. She was more than just a victim. She was a survivor. He, in turn, told her stories of the mountains, of the animals and the seasons. He taught her how to read the signs in the snow, how to tell one bird call from another. But he never told her about his past. He never told her he knew the brand on her wrist. He was afraid. Afraid of what she would think of him. Afraid of the danger that knowledge brought to their door. He told himself it was better not to know. They could build a life here, hidden away from the world. The baby would be born, and they would be a family. It was a fragile, foolish dream, and he knew it. But for a few short weeks, he allowed himself to believe in it. The dream shattered on a cold, clear morning in late February. Josiah was outside chopping wood when he saw them. Riders. A group of 5 men on the distant ridge, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of hunters closing in on their prey. His heart leaped into his throat. He ran inside. "Mercy," he said, his voice tight. "Get away from the window. We have company." She rushed to his side and her face went slack with terror. "It's him," she whispered. "Sheriff Coleman." But it wasn't just the sheriff. Riding beside him was her uncle, Samuel Caldwell. And the other 3 men were deputies, their badges glinting in the winter sun. They knew. They had come for her. He grabbed his rifle, his mind racing. He could fight. He could try to hold them off. But it was 5 against 1, and Mercy was in no condition to run. They were trapped. As the riders drew closer, Mercy grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You need to know." He looked down at her, at the fear in her green eyes. "What is it?" "Sheriff Coleman," she said, her words coming in a rush. "He's not just my uncle's brother-in-law. He was there. He helped them tie me to the tree." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A lawman, an officer of the court, sworn to protect the innocent, had helped leave a child to die. This wasn't a rescue. It was an execution squad, coming to finish the job. Josiah looked from the approaching riders to the terrified girl at his side. He had run from his past for years. He had hidden in the mountains, convinced he was a broken man, a coward. But looking at Mercy, he knew the time for running was over. The riders were almost at the cabin now. He could hear the crunch of their horses' hooves in the snow. He checked the load in his rifle. He didn't know if they would walk out of this alive. But he knew one thing for sure. They would not take her. Not while he was still breathing. Josiah stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands, not aiming, but ready. He stood between Mercy and the world, a silent, immovable object. The 5 riders pulled up, forming a grim semicircle in front of the cabin. Sheriff Coleman dismounted, a big man whose confidence came from the badge pinned to his chest. His eyes were cold, like chips of ice. "Creek," he boomed, his voice echoing in the quiet valley. "We know you have the girl. Send her out now, and there'll be no trouble." From beside him, Samuel Caldwell, a thin, pinched-faced man with cruelty in his eyes, sneered. "That girl is my ward. She belongs with her family." Josiah's laugh was a harsh, bitter sound. "Family? You call what you did to her family? You left her to die, Caldwell. I call that attempted murder." The deputies shifted in their saddles, their eyes darting between Josiah and their sheriff. It was clear they hadn't heard the full story. Coleman held up a hand, silencing any dissent. "What happens between a man and his ward is a family matter. The law is clear. She's a minor. She's unmarried. She comes with us." But then, a new voice cut through the tension, clear and strong from the cabin doorway. "I will not go back," Mercy said. She stepped out onto the porch to stand beside Josiah, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "I would rather die here with a good man than go back to you." Caldwell's face contorted with rage. "You see? He's poisoned her mind. Creek, you're nothing but a kidnapper, a degenerate who preys on young girls." A hot, white anger flared in Josiah's chest. He'd heard those words his whole life. Worthless, drunkard, criminal. He'd almost started to believe them. But standing here, protecting this girl, he felt a sense of purpose he'd never known. He felt worthy. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. And then he said the words that would change everything forever. "There's another way," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the still air. The deputies leaned in, intrigued. Even Coleman looked curious. "The law says she needs a guardian," Josiah said. "Or a husband." He turned and looked directly at Mercy, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm offering to be her husband." A stunned silence fell over the valley. You could have heard a snowflake land. Coleman's jaw dropped. Caldwell's face went from red to a blotchy, furious purple. "You can't be serious," Coleman finally sputtered. "You're old enough to be her grandfather." It was Mercy who answered, her voice ringing with a conviction that stunned them all. "He is a better man than any of you," she declared, moving to stand even closer to Josiah. "I accept his proposal." Caldwell exploded. "This is an outrage, a travesty. You can't let this happen." But Sheriff Coleman wasn't looking at Caldwell. He was looking at Josiah. And he was looking at Mercy. He was a lawman, but he wasn't a fool. He could see the truth in the way she stood by Josiah, unafraid. He could see how healthy she looked, how the terror in her eyes had been replaced by defiance. "The girl is willing," Coleman said slowly, thoughtfully. "And as far as I know, Creek here has no outstanding warrants." "What about his past?" Caldwell shrieked. "Ask anyone in Laramie. He was the town drunk, a brawler, a good-for-nothing." "Used to be," Josiah said, his voice calm and steady. "Haven't had a drop in over 4 years." One of the younger deputies, a boy with honest eyes, spoke up. "Sheriff, with all due respect, I think we should hear the girl out. Properly." Coleman nodded. He was a man who followed the letter of the law, and the law was getting complicated. "Mercy Caldwell," he said, his voice formal. "Step forward and tell us your side." Mercy walked down the steps, her head held high. She looked small and fragile in front of those armed men, but her voice was a rock. She told them everything. About the shame, the cruelty, about being driven into the wilderness. And then she pointed a trembling finger at the sheriff. "And you," she said, her voice shaking with righteous anger. "You were there. You held the rope." A gasp went through the deputies. They stared at their sheriff, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. Coleman's face paled. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to survive, let alone to stand here and accuse him in front of his own men. "She's lying!" Caldwell screamed. "He's coached her. It's all lies." "No," the young deputy said, his hand moving away from his pistol. "I believe her. And Mr. Caldwell, what you did, that ain't just a family matter. That's a crime." Coleman saw the tide turning against him. He saw the doubt in his men's eyes. He made a decision. "All right," he said, holding up his hands. "Here's how it's going to be. If they want to get married, the law says they can. Once she's a married woman, she's her husband's responsibility, not her uncle's." Caldwell looked like he was about to have a stroke. "This is madness." "What's madness?" Coleman shot back, his eyes flashing. "Is leaving a pregnant girl to die in a blizzard. I have half a mind to lock you up myself, Samuel." Caldwell saw it was over. He looked at his supposed allies and saw only contempt. He spat on the ground. "Fine," he snarled. "But when this all goes wrong, don't come crying to me. That child she's carrying is cursed. It will bring you nothing but misery." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his fury kicking up a cloud of snow. Sheriff Coleman looked at Josiah and Mercy. He was a compromised man, a guilty man, but he was also a practical one. He tipped his hat. "Congratulations, I suppose," he said, a faint wry smile on his lips. "Just be sure to find a preacher. Make it legal." As the riders disappeared over the ridge, leaving a profound silence in their wake, Mercy turned to Josiah, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Did you mean it?" she whispered. "About marrying me?" Josiah looked down at this incredible girl, this fierce survivor who had faced down her demons and won. He reached out and took her hand. "I've never meant anything more in my life," he said. She broke into a smile then, a smile so bright it could have melted the snow. "Then I'll be proud to be your wife, Josiah Creek." And just as he was leaning in, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun, Mercy gasped. Her eyes went wide. She clutched her belly, and a sudden torrent of water gushed down, soaking the front of her dress and steaming in the cold air. The baby was coming. Now. A storm was rolling in from the west, the sky turning a bruised purple. It was as if the heavens themselves were mirroring the chaos that had just erupted. "It's time," Mercy gasped, her knuckles white as she gripped the porch railing. Josiah's mind, which had been so clear and focused during the confrontation, suddenly went blank with panic. He'd helped birth foals and calves, but this was different. This was Mercy. This was their child. He swept her up into his arms and carried her back inside, the thunder rolling closer with every step. He laid her on the bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. breathe, Mercy, he said, trying to keep his own voice steady. Just breathe. He scrambled to get things ready, his hands fumbling. He stoked the fire, put a great pot of water on to boil, gathered the clean cloths he'd set aside weeks ago. Rain began to lash against the cabin, driven by a furious wind. The labor was fast and brutal. Mercy's pains came one on top of the other, with no time for rest in between. She cried out, her voice raw, and the sound tore at Josiah's soul. He felt useless, a clumsy oaf in the face of this primal, powerful force of nature. "I can't do it, Josiah!" she screamed, her body arching in agony. "I'm not strong enough." He knelt by the bed and took her hand, gripping it tight. "Yes, you are," he said, his voice fierce. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. You survived the cold. You survived them. You can survive this." He stayed by her side, wiping her brow, murmuring words of encouragement, trying to channel his own strength into her. The hours bled together, a blur of pain and fear and hope. The storm outside reached a fever pitch, lightning splitting the sky, thunder shaking the very foundations of the cabin. It was a war, a battle between life and death being fought in that tiny room, with the whole world raging around them. Josiah lost all track of time. He forgot the men who had come for them, forgot his own past, forgot everything but the woman on the bed and the child fighting its way into the world. He found himself praying again, not with words, but with a desperate, silent plea from the depths of his being. Let them live. Please, just let them live. Then, just as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the window, the storm outside began to subside. And in the sudden quiet, a new sound filled the cabin. A sharp, piercing cry, the cry of a newborn baby. Josiah, moving on pure instinct, caught the small, slippery body in his large, weathered hands. He cleared the baby's mouth, and it let out another lusty yell, its tiny fists waving in the air. He looked at the perfect fingers, the tiny, wrinkled face, the shock of dark hair. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees washed over him. "It's a boy, Mercy," he said, his voice thick and choked. "We have a son." He cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a warm blanket, then laid him in Mercy's waiting arms. Tears of exhaustion and joy streamed down her face as she looked at her son for the first time. "He's so beautiful," she whispered. "Oh, Josiah, he's perfect." She looked up at him, her green eyes shining with a love that took his breath away. "What should we name him?" Josiah walked to the window and looked out. The storm had passed. The clouds were breaking apart, and the rising sun was painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. It was a new day, a new beginning. After so many years of darkness and solitude, it felt like the sun was rising in his own soul. "Daniel," he said softly. "His name is Daniel Creek." The name meant, "God is my judge." And Josiah figured that was about right. Let God judge him, not men like Samuel Caldwell or Elias Thorne. Mercy held Daniel close, humming a soft lullaby, and in that moment, Josiah knew he was home. Everything he had ever searched for, everything he had ever needed, was right here in this room. He was a husband. He was a father. He had a family. But as he watched the sunrise, a shadow of doubt crept into his heart. Elias Thorne was not a man who forgot or forgave. Sooner or later he would hear whispers of a girl named Mercy and a baby born in the mountains. And when he did, he would come looking. Their peaceful valley was a sanctuary, but Josiah knew it might not be a fortress. The world was out there, and it had a long memory. 5 years passed. 5 years of peace. 5 years of watching a family grow where only a lonely man had been before. The valley became their entire world, a haven carved out of the wilderness. Josiah taught Daniel the ways of the mountain. The boy, at 5 years old, could read the tracks of a deer, tell the difference between the call of a hawk and an eagle, and cast a line into the creek with a steady hand. He had Josiah's quiet strength and his mother's bright, curious mind. Mercy, in turn, taught him his letters and his numbers. She read to him from Josiah's small collection of books every night by the firelight. The dream she'd once had of being a teacher was fulfilled in the most intimate way imaginable. The awkward proposal on the porch had blossomed into a deep and abiding love. Josiah and Mercy were more than just husband and wife. They were partners, two halves of a whole, bound together by the trials they had faced and the son they adored. The memory of Sheriff Coleman and Samuel Caldwell faded, becoming a ghost story they told themselves to remember how far they had come. They were the Creeks. This was their home. They were safe. But the world outside the valley had not forgotten them. The peace was shattered on a summer morning, bright and clear. Daniel was down by the creek, trying to catch frogs. Mercy was tending her garden, a vibrant patch of green that she had coaxed from the rocky soil. Josiah was on the porch, oiling his rifle when he saw them. Riders. Not the bumbling posse of a compromised sheriff this time. These men rode with a purpose, their horses sleek and expensive. And the man in the lead, sitting tall in a saddle trimmed with silver, was a man Josiah had hoped he would never see again. Elias Thorne, the king of Wyoming, the father of the boy who had abandoned Mercy, the grandfather of the child playing by the creek. He had come at last. A cold dread washed over Josiah. He called out, his voice sharp with urgency. "Mercy! Get Daniel inside. Now!" Mercy looked up, saw the riders, and her face went pale. She scooped up Daniel and ran for the cabin, her garden forgotten. Josiah stood, his rifle now heavy with intent. He was no longer the scared man who had run from his past. He was a father and a husband, and he would defend his family to his last breath. Thorne and his men, there were 6 of them, all heavily armed, pulled up in front of the cabin. Thorne dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He was an older man, with a mane of white hair and eyes as hard and gray as granite. He looked at Josiah, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Josiah Creek," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet, Thorne," Josiah replied, his hand steady on his rifle. "What do you want?" Thorne's gaze swept over the small, tidy cabin, the garden, the boy who was now peeking out from behind his mother's skirts in the doorway. His eyes lingered on Daniel. "I've heard stories," Thorne said. "Stories about a girl my son left behind. Stories about a child. I've come to see if they're true." "They're true," Mercy said, stepping out onto the porch. She stood beside Josiah, her fear hidden behind a wall of pure defiance. Daniel clung to her leg, his eyes wide. "Robert was your son, and this is his." Thorne studied her, his expression unreadable. "My son is dead," he said flatly. "Died of a fever in a California gutter. He brought nothing but shame to my name." He took a step closer. "But his child is my blood. The boy comes with me." Josiah raised the rifle, the click of the hammer being cocked echoing in the sudden silence. "You're not taking him." Thorne chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Don't be a fool, Creek. You can't fight me. I own this territory. I own the law. I will have the boy. He will be raised as a Thorne, with wealth and power. He will have a life you could never give him." "He has a life," Mercy said, her voice shaking but strong. "He has a father who loves him. He has a mother. He has a home. That is more than your money can ever buy." "Sentiment," Thorne sneered. "It's a weakness. I'm offering the boy a future. I am his grandfather. I have a right." "You have no rights here," Josiah said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have a choice. You can turn around and ride away, or you can die here, today." Thorne's men shifted, their hands going to their pistols. The air crackled with tension. It was a standoff, 7 guns against 1. But Thorne wasn't looking at his men. He was looking at Daniel. The boy, no longer hiding, stepped out from behind his mother. He looked at the powerful old man on the horse, then at his father, standing tall with the rifle. He wasn't afraid. He walked to the edge of the porch, his small face serious. He pointed a finger at Elias Thorne. "You can't have me," the 5-year-old said, his voice small but clear as a bell. "This is my home. That's my pa. And that's my ma. You go away." The simple, defiant words of a child did what Josiah's rifle could not. They broke through Elias Thorne's armor of pride and power. He stared at his grandson, this fearless little boy who was the spitting image of the son he had lost. For the first time, Josiah saw something other than arrogance in the old man's eyes. He saw a flicker of pain, of loss, of regret. Thorne looked from the boy to Mercy, then to Josiah. He saw not a kidnapper and his victim, but a family. A strong, loving family. He saw what his own son had thrown away. He saw the future he could never have. He looked at Daniel one last time, a long, searching look. Then, without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and motioned for his men to follow. He rode away, leaving the valley as quietly as he had entered. Josiah lowered his rifle, his body trembling with the adrenaline leaving his system. Mercy rushed to him, wrapping her arms around him. Daniel ran into his father's embrace. They stood there on the porch, a small, unbreakable circle, as the dust from the riders settled. They had faced down the richest, most powerful man in Wyoming and won. They had won with love, with courage, and with the simple, undeniable truth of their family. Josiah looked at his wife and his son, the two people who had given his broken life meaning. He had found more than just peace in these mountains. He had found redemption. He had become the man he was always meant to be. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The valley was quiet again, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the gentle murmur of the creek. Their sanctuary was safe. Their home was secure. And Josiah Creek knew, with a certainty that filled his soul, that they would live out their days here, together, in the heart of the wilderness that had saved them all. What do you think makes a person truly worthy? Is it the life they're born into, or the choices they make when everything is on the line? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of courage and redemption.